Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Gabe Gutierrez in Washington, where the White House is facing blowback from Democrats and pushback from Republicans over comments made by President Trump about taking over elections in Democratic-led states and also having Republicans in Congress nationalize elections. The White House trying to clarify and walk back some of those comments amid the escalating resistance on Capitol Hill. We'll have much more on the president's comments and the fallout in a moment. But the controversy comes as Congress has approved a Trump-backed funding deal, ending a brief partial government shutdown. The House narrowly passing the legislation this afternoon, with 21 Democrats joining with 196 Republicans to send it to the president's desk after it passed the Senate last week. President Trump, who urged House lawmakers to pass the measure with no changes yesterday, is vowing to sign it immediately. The deal setting the stage for a two-week fight over funding for ICE and the Department of Homeland Security, sparked by the Trump administration's immigration crackdown in Minnesota. The White House previewing those negotiations today.
We're willing, obviously, to have this dialogue and to talk and to listen, but we are not going to concede in enforcing our nation's immigration laws and delivering on the mandate the president was given by nearly 80 million Americans to deport illegal alien criminals from our country.
It all comes after DHS Secretary Kristi Noem announced yesterday that all federal officers in Minneapolis would be equipped with body cameras in the wake of the killings of two U.S. citizens, Renee Good and Alex Preddy, by federal officials. Today, here in Washington, we heard from Good's brothers who testified at a Democratic forum on DHS force.
This is not just a bad day or a rough week or isolated incidents. These encounters with federal agents are changing the community and changing many lives, including ours, forever. And I still don't know how to explain to my 4-year-old what these agents are doing when we pass by.
Joining me now from the White House is NBC News Chief Justice and National Affairs correspondent Kelly O'Donnell and NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Julie Tsirkin. Thank you both for joining me. Kelly, I want to start with you. How involved does President Trump plan to be in these DHS funding talks over the next 2 weeks?
Well, we've heard a few different signals when it comes to the president's involvement in DHS matters, both policy and budgeting. He has wanted to try to avert the shutdown to get the business of government back on track. And at the same time, he's also distanced himself from some of the policy matters, things like the decision by Secretary Noem to have body cameras or decisions about how things will work in terms of the tactics being used. However, saying Homan, who is now there, Tom Homan, in Minnesota overseeing operations, would report directly to him. So that's certainly a direct connection with the president and these issues. But it will be a thorny period for the president, and this is one of his signature issues in terms of enforcement of border security, in terms of the influx of immigrants into the country, but these interior operations have been so problematic in terms of the deaths that have occurred, questions about the detaining of people who are members of the community where there's been a lot of pushback, and at the same time, the president trying to meet the goals that he talked about and that do have support, especially from his MAGA base. Not as much among many of those in Minnesota. So a few different signals from the president when it comes to this, the funding and the policy.
Well, Kelly, DHS Secretary Kristi Noem announced late yesterday that all federal officers in Minneapolis would be wearing body cameras. Do we know what led to that decision?
Well, there's been discussion and push for this, and it comes in the form of the public wanting to have an inside look at these interactions. But it is also about officer safety in terms of the Department of Homeland Security making clear that they are seeing a huge spike in threats against federal officers. So there can be advantages in both directions for the public's awareness and for officer safety. At the same time, the president said this would be something that they would be talking about, but he also said it was very much Noem's decision. Certainly the appropriations had been there. Why it had not been done already is a question, but she is saying this will now be a tool that there is the funding for, there are the availability of the units that the officers would wear, and what it doesn't do is address other questions like specifically tactics, tactics or the wearing of masks. But the cameras themselves are certainly an issue where there's broad appreciation for what video can do from all angles of how people look at this. Those concerned about what's happening to officers, those concerned about what's happening to the public. Gabe?
Yeah, Kelly, I thought it was interesting to hear the president say that it was Kristi Noem's decision, essentially distancing himself from it. But Julie, I want to turn to you over at the Hill. Where does the funding fight over ICE and DHS go now?
Well, if you can believe it, Gabe, the funding bill that the House muscled through today was the easy part. Now comes the hard part. They have a week and a half, essentially, to try and come together over these demands that Democrats are making. Leader Schumer just told me a couple of minutes ago that they are crystallizing their reforms in full. They're going to send them to House and Senate, Republican leadership, and the White House shortly. Translation, they did not yet start these negotiations in earnest. And there's also a lot of finger pointing happening. Who's in charge of these negotiations? Senate Republicans are distancing themselves from that, in part because this is going to be a really uphill battle. It is extremely hard to see how they're going to come together on this, in part because it would be Republicans essentially agreeing to hamstring the administration's authority, their own Republican White House's authority, and the ability that they're able to have, the latitude they're able to have in these ICE operations around the country. Take a listen to a little bit of what we heard from Speaker Johnson.
We hope that they will operate in good faith over the next 10 days as we negotiate this. The president, again, has reached out. We are restoring calm in Minnesota, but again, we make the plea and the demand that the governors and the mayors in these blue states and blue cities participate with federal law enforcement so that we have a safer environment in which to implement and to enforce federal immigration laws.
Now, as Kelly was just talking about, the administration is already taking some proactive steps, for example, on body cameras. But that's not enough, not even for moderate Democrats like Angus King, for example, who told me he needs to see these changes codified into law or he's going to be on a no on any DHS funding deal that comes together.
You know, Julie, how was Speaker Johnson able to get this deal across the finish line today?
Well, it started with President Trump when he posted on Truth Social, essentially getting Republican holdouts who wanted to see the SAVE Act. It's a Republican piece of legislation that would require proof of citizenship. That is already a requirement. You cannot vote if you do not have that. Schumer and Democrats saying that is a non-starter. Well, President Trump posted essentially saying that Republicans need to pass the funding bill as is, meaning they couldn't attach that piece to the funding package. That's how they were able to muscle it through. There were holdouts, though. Speaker Johnson has gotten quite accustomed to wrangling and dealing with holdouts as he navigates a very narrow majority. There were conversations happening in the cloakroom, in the back of the floor. Speaker Johnson even directly engaging in animated conversations with members. But again, as I told you, that was the easy part. Now comes the hard part, because getting Republicans, especially in the House, to agree to make these kinds of changes to DHS without, for example, defunding sanctuary cities, something Republicans want, without, for example, attaching the SAVE Act that I just mentioned to this bill, that'll be extremely difficult.
Kelly, Julie, I want you to stick around for a minute because we have a lot to cover here. As we mentioned, President Trump has once again raised the prospect of changing the country's election system, suggesting to his former deputy FBI director, Dan Bongino, on his podcast that the federal government take control of elections.
These people were brought to our country to vote, and they vote illegally. And amazing that the Republicans aren't tougher on it. The Republicans should say, we want to take over. We should take over the voting in at least 15 places. The Republicans ought to nationalize the voting. And we have states that are so crooked, and they're counting votes.
Of course, the Constitution grants decisions about elections to the states in Article 1. Quote, the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. Pressed on the president's comments, Republican leaders on Capitol Hill pushed back on his suggestions delicately.
I'm not in favor of federalizing elections, no. I mean, I think that's a constitutional issue.
It's always been the responsibility of the states to administer elections, and it's a system that works well so long as the states make it a priority to ensure the integrity of our elections. And we have real concerns about some of the blue states, frankly, that have not been doing that well.
Meanwhile, as you'd expect, Democrats are offering a much more forceful denunciation.
This is more dangerous autocratic poison from Donald Trump. I ask my Republican colleagues, when the hell will you find your voice? When he says that we should nationalize the elections and Republicans should take over and you don't make a peep? What's going on here? You're just so afraid?
I have deep concerns about the fairness of our elections in 26 and 28 right now. I have concerns about the elections in primaries. These kind of actions that have taken place over the last year, as we've seen this systemic dismantling of the very protections that were put in place by, again, the first Trump administration. If it doesn't scare the heck out of you, it should.
White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt this afternoon appearing to try to clarify or clean up the president's comments, saying he was merely talking about a piece of legislation in Congress to mandate proof of citizenship to vote.
What the president was referring to is the SAVE Act, which is a huge common sense piece of legislation that Republicans have supported, that President Trump is committed to signing into law during his term. And he spoke with the speaker directly about that yesterday, about the need to get that bill on the floor for a vote, because it provides very common sense measures for voting in our country.
Of course, the president has a long and well-documented history of pushing baseless election conspiracies. And just 2 weeks ago, he raised the specter of canceling the midterms, with Reuters reporting that during an interview, he boasted that he had accomplished so much that when you think of it, we shouldn't even have an election. The White House has said he was joking. But Kelly O'Donnell and Julie Tsirkin are still with me for more on this. Kelly, I want to go back to you. The president raised the prospect of nationalizing elections. The Constitution obviously seems pretty clear on this. Is there any way for the president to pursue this unilaterally? Both Leader Thune and Speaker Johnson seem to quickly dismiss it.
Well, certainly the Constitution carries the weight here, and states could sue to prevent steps that the president might take. And when we hear the discussion of the president may have meant the SAVE Act, what's hard to understand there is why he would have referenced 15 states as an example of where he thought there needed to be nationalizing of the elections, because any federal law applies all across the country in all 50 states. So that doesn't quite square up in terms of what the president was interested in. We've also just learned from the White House the president is going to sign the funding bill that we were talking about a few minutes ago at 4:30 this afternoon. So there would be an opportunity perhaps to hear the president talk about some of these issues, including the one you're raising. What does he mean by nationalizing? So it is important to note that when Republican leaders are pushing back on this, certainly Democrats would, and state elections officials across the country would have concerns about this, because the Constitution certainly contemplated, and it makes clear that the planning of elections, the carrying out of elections, all of the responsibilities associated with that, that's the domain of states, and it's part of a system that is supposed to decentralize elections to give people more confidence in the integrity of the process, making it local, so it is your neighbors and your locally elected officials who are responsible for that, and not elections decided by the central government. So how the president would go forward, we don't know. His impulse toward this is easier to understand, because we know the president wants to convince the public that there are irregularities in elections that could change the outcome, or as he claims falsely, that they changed the outcome in 2020.
And of course, Kelly, we will be watching at 4:30 to see if, in fact, we can ask the president some questions. But Julie, I want to turn back to you. We did hear some of that reaction on Capitol Hill. Is this what Republicans on the Hill really want to be talking about right now?
No, absolutely not. And there's two reasons for that. The first being that conservatives at their core believe in states' rights. So the fact that any Republicans up here, certainly in leadership, especially someone like Speaker Johnson, a constitutional lawyer by heart, by trade, the expectation that they would go along with something like this is a non-starter. And that is exactly why I think we heard from both him and Thune the reaction that we did, that this is not constitutional. And Thune even pivoted a couple of hours after we talked to him this morning at a press conference when he was pressed by NBC News that President Trump was referring to the SAVE Act, the piece of legislation that we were just talking about that would, of course, require proof of citizenship when you're actually going to vote. Again, a non-starter for Democrats, but it's interesting how both the White House and Caroline Leavitt and Republicans here are trying to pivot the president's remarks for him. And the second reason why this is a non-starter is because Republicans that I talked to up here, even allies of the president, know that his worst issue, one that he shouldn't be highlighting, is continuing to look back at 2020 stolen election claims. Republicans, even when he was running this time around in 2024, said the president should stay on message, talk about his best issues, which is immigration. Of course, now things have changed slightly. The economy, other things that Republicans prefer to run on in the midterm elections, not looking backwards.
And Julie, certainly an evolving set of remarks. Kelly, this all comes after the FBI raided an election center in Fulton County, Georgia. How much of the president's recent comments continue to be driven by his fixation on the 2020 election?
I think you could argue that there's quite a lot of influence about that, and it also ties into the president's very public discussion of retribution and wanting to, in effect, settle the scores of issues that have bothered him for some time. So that includes some of the political weaponization as he has perceived it. And the events in Fulton County, Georgia, what really stands out there is if he had prevailed in 2020 in Georgia, that would not have been enough for him to win the overall election. He was very drawn to Fulton County and as he said at the time, the fewer than 12,000 votes that were at issue in that county. So the questions really now are, what is the purpose of the FBI, which did have a warrant that was approved by a judge to go in and get the records, get the ballots. They have now been moved to a facility in Virginia, an FBI facility, where those are being stored. What is the investigation and what are they looking for? And there are larger questions about if they are looking at the evidence from 6 years ago, how, if at all, does it affect the immediate concerns about the midterm elections, the 2028 elections? There are a lot of questions there, but the president's interest in this is certainly beyond dispute. He talks about it often. He puts pressure on those who report to him, and that's part of what we're seeing.
And Julie, I want to play more of what Intel Vice Chair Warner said today. Let's listen to that.
The Director of National Intelligence does not conduct criminal investigations. She has no role in executing search warrants. And she does not belong on the scene of a domestic FBI search, particularly one tied to the president's personal grievances carried out under the pretense of normal law enforcement.
You know, Julie, it's so interesting. Is there a similar frustration from even some Republicans? Is there any chance Tulsi Gabbard appears before Congress in the near term?
Well, there definitely is a similar frustration. It's why her confirmation process a year ago, Gabe, was such an uphill climb for Republicans because of her past statements, because of concerns that she is not up to par for this kind of role, even from Tom Cotton, who chairs the Intel Committee that Warner is the vice chair of. He's expressed some concerns in the past, but those concerns have dissipated. They have changed, at least publicly, because today at a leadership press conference, we pressed Tom Cotton, the chair of the Intel panel, if he would call Gabbard in to testify. And he ignored the question entirely. And I thought what was so notable, what stood out so much from Warner's remarks, is that somebody with his position, he's been on the Intel Committee for a long time, he's held either a chair or a ranking position on that panel. He said that he does not believe that the 2026 and 2028 elections will be secured. That is an extremely significant statement coming from somebody of his caliber. I would be interested to see in the coming months how Republicans begin to respond to this publicly. But again, extremely difficult when you have President Trump sitting at the other side of Pennsylvania Avenue. Significant statement indeed. Julie Tsirkin live for us on Capitol Hill. Kelly O'Donnell for us at the White House. Thank you both.
We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.